Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my Stack Up series. Today we'll be talking about Mercedes, who came in fourth in the constructor standings. So we'll be comparing them against Aston Martin and Red Bull, as well as the two Mercedes drivers, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, and where they came in the Drivers' Championship and compare them against those around them. So we will compare them against Sergio Perez and Carlos Sainz in regards to themselves as well, since they all were like 6th and 7th for the Mercedes, so they were close together, so we get to expand just a tad bit on those standings. So without further ado, we'll start off with some general stats. So here we see some general stats for Mercedes and the two Mercedes drivers. Of course, we know Mercedes came in fourth in the constructor standings. Their average starting position was 7th, and their average finishing position was 6th. They had a total of 4 DNFs in this season, kind of split evenly between George Russell and Lewis Hamilton. Now, if you look at the two drivers themselves, you see George Russell, who came in 6th in the Drivers' Championship. His average starting position was 6, and his average finishing position was 6. And he had 2 of those DNFs. As I said, they're evenly split between the two drivers. And if we look at Lewis Hamilton, he came in 7th, just behind his teammate in the Drivers' Championship. His average starting position was 9th, so a little bit lower than George Russell, but he was able to gain those positions because his average finishing position was 6th as well. So you can kind of see those drivers are fairly evenly matched in this season's worth of that Mercedes livery and how they were able to compete this season. So you will see that throughout this time when the graphs kind of match evenly, where the Mercedes are having a little bit of more issues and in each track. But we can kind of compare the drivers in each of those races, which is really kind of interesting to see in my viewpoint, where Lewis Hamilton seems to be a little bit struggling a little bit more in this type of Mercedes season specs than George Russell was. Like normal, we'll compare the two Mercedes drivers in the 6 sprint races that we had this season. So you have Lewis Hamilton in blue and George Russell in red. And of course, the finishing position is where we want to see that result in. And so the lower, the better on these graphs. And that trend line, if it's going down, that's better, as that reflects those finishing positions in this season. So as you can see, Lewis Hamilton started off very strong in China in that sprint race, but then kind of lagged behind George Russell and the rest of the sprint races, kind of matching that ebb and flow of each race. So you can kind of tell where Mercedes was kind of struggling a little bit more in those like races like Miami and Brazil, where they were stronger in Austria and Circuit of the Americas, and they're kind of coming back in Qatar as well. But they're kind of nice evenly matched, keeping that swoops kind of even between the two drivers. It makes you think how that Mercedes itself was responding to those. Now, as I said earlier, that seems to be that George Russell was able to attune himself to that vehicle more than Lewis Hamilton was, as he was able to get better results on average over his teammate throughout the season, especially in the sprint races, kind of evenly matched that throughout these 6 sprint races. Diving into a little bit more detail here, we see George Russell compared to Lewis Hamilton versus Carlos Sainz. So we see George in blue, Lewis in yellow, and Carlos in red. So you already kind of compared the two Mercedes drivers, so we have to add Carlos Sainz into this mix and see where he lays out in that comparison to these drivers and where they ended up. And so you look at that and you see Carlos very strong, because we're looking at that point range for the sprint races. So you have to keep that in mind in these graphs and figure out where they're getting the points from and where they're getting outside those points, to kind of compare that, as well as how well they did in each race. But Carlos is very consistent across that 5th marker in this running of these sprint races in that Ferrari, gaining some ground in Circuit of the Americas, and then kind of lagging out again a little bit in Brazil, but fairly steady, getting better throughout the season. So that trend line slightly going down, which is a good thing. Hopefully he can work that out in Williams next season, but in that Ferrari, it's getting better, even though it's slow this past season. Whereas we see Lewis Hamilton slightly getting worse throughout the season, kind of ebbing out of that range, And we have George Russell getting much better throughout this season in that trend line business. So you can see that George Russell is doing a much better job than his teammate in the sprint races, and potentially could have outdid Carlos Sainz in those sprint races if the season continued on. It would have evened out a little bit more in that running. Now moving on, we compare Lewis Hamilton to Sergio Perez and his teammate George Russell in these sprint races. And so we kind of look at these numbers and we see Sergio Perez in red here, where George Russell switches over to that yellow marker, where Lewis Hamilton's in that blue. So we see that Sergio Perez started off very strong in the sprint races in China and Miami, but kind of slowly got worse as that went through and was ending up fairly bad off near the end of the season. So his trend line is going up fairly steadily. So he's getting pretty bad throughout the season in those sprint races compared to the two Mercedes drivers, in that running where George Russell was getting better. And then Lewis Hamilton was slightly off, getting slightly worse throughout the season, but still competitive in that running. Now we get to the meat here, where we're looking at the GP races. And so we can compare the two Mercedes in all of the GP races this season. And we see that they start off very similar, with George Russell ahead of Lewis Hamilton. And then we had a little issue over in Australia. And then they were kind of competing against each other, where overtaking one over the other slightly here and there, where Lewis Hamilton was able to tweak out his teammate on some of those regards. But then we hit Great Britain, where George Russell had a very bad off. And then it started coming back down, where Lewis Hamilton was doing fairly well. And then we have Lewis Hamilton at the end of the season slowly getting those off ones that are here and there, making him much worse in that standing, because he's not really as consistent as he should be compared to his teammate George Russell, who seemed to be really competitive and still gaining ground throughout the season, as that trend line shows, is going fairly good into the closer to that 4 marker place marker in that running, compared to like what you saw at the very beginning of the stats, where that average was that 6th finishing position. So you can see he's getting better throughout the season, working his way towards that 5th and maybe even 4th marker at the end of the season for his finishing position, whereas Lewis Hamilton was slightly getting better, but not quite as fast as his teammate was. And with those little offs here and there at the very end of the season, where you can see those, spikes in his finishing positions, that didn't help him either. So he wasn't quite as consistent at the end of the season in that Mercedes as his teammate was, which hurt him significantly, even though George Russell had that really bad off in the middle of the season. And again, for the GP races, we're comparing George Russell versus his teammate Lewis Hamilton versus Carlos Sainz. So we add basically Carlos Sainz here in red, just like we had on the sprint races. And you can see that Carlos in that Ferrari was doing significantly better than both of those Mercedes drivers at the very beginning. And then they kind of had that middle section where the Mercedes were kind of outpacing that Ferrari. And at the end, it was kind of an even mix between, what track was better for the Ferrari and what track was better for the Mercedes. But overall, you can kind of know that the Ferrari ended up ahead of Mercedes in that constructor standing, as well as the drivers for Carlos Sainz. So, again, given enough time, that Mercedes could have been developed and tweaked out potentially to get their drivers ahead of Carlos in the driver standings. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And so we have Carlos Sainz taking the lead over the two Mercedes drivers. And you can kind of see that basically throughout the whole season is what that tied to that, as Mercedes drivers were getting slightly better in that running throughout the season, whereas Carlos was fairly steady throughout the season in that trend line, pretty close to that 4 marker, maybe that 3 marker in that trend line finishing position there. So he was doing really well in that Ferrari, but the Mercedes drivers were actually gaining a little bit of ground throughout this season. Now we switch that over to Sergio Perez, who finished slightly behind Lewis Hamilton in that driver standings. And so you see him starting off the season really strong, and then he was getting worse throughout the season. So he has that really good beginning of the season in that Red Bull, and then kind of gets to the mediocre stage and then end up getting pretty bad at the end of the season compared to the two Mercedes drivers. So his trend line's going up fairly significantly throughout the season, which kind of shows, the thought pattern for Red Bull in the sense of that they were thinking hopefully they could turn him around in that midpoint marker and get him performing better and getting that Red Bull back into the shape that it needed to be. But unfortunately, he kept tailing off near the end of the season, not doing as well as he should have done, especially considering his beginning of the season and where that Red Bull relies. So is that related to how well the Mercedes was developed throughout the season and the lack of development progression for that Red Bull, or is there something else involved? You have to kind of take those two in effect, and you have to look at where Max Verstappen kind of was in those running as well, which will be later in this series. But you compared, Sergio Perez to the two Mercedes drivers, and you can kind of see what's going on here, where both George Russell and Sergio had that off in Great Britain, probably related to each other in that incident. But overall, Sergio Perez was getting worse throughout the season compared to George Russell, especially, and Lewis Hamilton in this run. Wasn't able to really overtake those drivers at the end. And here we're comparing the three teams, right? We're comparing Mercedes against Aston Martin versus Red Bull. So we have Mercedes in that, that teal aqua color, where Aston Martin is in the green and Red Bull is in the red. So you can know that Aston Martin was doing a little bit of here and there on those points, and so they're kind of below both of those other two teams. Whereas you see Mercedes, having that first third quarter of the season where they were doing decent but not gaining a lot of points, but then in the last 2/3 or 3/4 of the season they started gaining a decent amount of points, and you can see those spikes in that aqua or teal color for Mercedes, and that trend line is going up. In this case, that means better because that's the more points you were getting throughout the season per race. So you can see that trend line going up. So they're getting a lot more points at the end of the season than they were at the beginning of the season, getting competitive against that Red Bull. Whereas that Red Bull was almost the opposite of Mercedes, where they were doing really well at the very beginning of the season, gaining lots of points, 1/3 marker, or potentially that 1/4 marker on the season. They kind of dropped down to doing decently on the points, but not as well as they should be in comparative to that first section of the season. Still gaining decent amount of points, but going in that downward trend overall for points throughout the season. And that's what that shows, at that trend line going down. And of course, Aston Martin is slowly getting less points throughout the season, but they were farther down on that scale, so they don't really even competitive against the Mercedes or the Red Bulls in that regard. And that shows up here on the same data, but just in a step graph format. So you can see that, Aston Martin's lagging fairly significantly behind both the Mercedes and the Red Bull. They had that little bit of area at the beginning around Australia where they were competitive against the Mercedes, but then they kind of plateaued off where Mercedes was able to keep gaining ground. So we can see that Mercedes is having kind of a parallel performance with Red Bull, just lagging behind slightly against that Red Bull overall. That little front section was the one that hurt them the most, and then they were gaining ground over all of that. So slightly, lowering that gap between them and the Red Bull, but not near as fast as they needed to be to really be competitive against and put pressure on that Red Bull for the constructors standing on that third position that Red Bull was in. That was a nice and interesting graph there, just to kind of show you where the three teams were and how competitive they were against each other throughout the season on those point ranges for that constructor stand. So what does that lead us to? That leads us to the stack up for Red Bull. So next time we will see how Red Bull stacked up against those constructors around them, and how Perez and Max Verstappen compared to the drivers around them in the drivers' standings as well. So we'll get a little bit of split mix since it's a little bit farther apart than the two Mercedes. So if you'd like to see that, you might want to think about subscribing. Hopefully get that notification when that video comes out. And of course, if you made it this far, I'd appreciate a like, because it helps that pesky, YouTube algorithm in that running. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.